For many Americans, the events of the past couple of years can seem utterly unprecedented. Few can remember a time when the country was so dramatically polarized. According to the Reuters news agency, in the year leading up to the 2024 presidential election, there were over 300 acts of political violence in the United States, with another 150 in the first 6 months of 2025. This represents the biggest surge in political violence since the early 1970s. And for the first time in decades, we have witnessed several political assassinations in this country, with people across the political spectrum being targeted.
The killing of conservative activist Charlie Kirk yesterday at a college in Utah is just the latest in a series of politically motivated violent acts just in recent months.
Investigators say that Vance Belter posed as a police officer and fatally shot former Minnesota House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark around 3.
A gunman opened fire on a Dallas immigration office, killing 2 detainees and injuring another.
A Pennsylvania man is in custody and charged with setting fire to the governor's mansion in Harrisburg early Sunday morning, after the first night of Passover.
Many have publicly worried that without some form of intervention, we may be headed toward another civil war. But the last civil war in the United States happened so long ago that for most people it's little more than an abstraction, a unit in high school history class. And when most people do think about the Civil War, they tend to think of it in terms of the South pitted against the North over the issue of slavery, with massive armies fighting each other on now famous battlefields, with names like Gettysburg and Antietam. But 160 years ago, things were incredibly more complicated. There were Southerners who were diametrically opposed to slavery and passionate about maintaining the integrity of the Union. And there were large numbers of Northerners who were extremely unhappy with the call to end slavery and the war that followed. And some of them plotted a massive insurrection with allies in the Confederacy.
And there were these radical groups, sort of similar to the Oath Keepers today, or the Proud Boys, called under various names. One of the most famous was Sons of Liberty. Nobody knows how big they are, but they claimed tens of thousands of members. And they will openly start meeting with Confederates to plot a combined assault.
The Confederates in question were soldiers who had escaped from Union prisons and were now living in Canada. Once there, they found like-minded Northerners who had been exiled from the United States for their political beliefs and were more than willing to help thwart Lincoln and the Union Army.
You know, the institutions of American democracy are not as solid as we all hope they would be. And there are some fragile points that a well-committed and organized group of anti-governmental treasonous actors can really target and bring down a government in peacetime, but especially in war.
In the midst of the Civil War, we had a deeply unpopular president in Abraham Lincoln who had suspended civil liberties and invoked martial law, using as his rationale the threat posed by his political opponents on the national security of the country. Because so much time has passed, it is easy to dismiss the relevance of those times to that of our own. But if you squint just a little bit, you can see the overall shape of many of the same issues we are arguing about today. How powerful should a president be? When should they be able to invoke martial law and imprison Americans without due process? In what way should Congress and the courts intervene when they think a president is behaving badly, against the best interests of the country? What should states do if they disagree profoundly with the policies of the federal government? And what should citizens do if they believe that the country is in danger and that they are not being sufficiently protected by the checks and balances enshrined in the U.S. Constitution? These are precisely the issues that were on the table in the 1860s, and again part of our reality in the here and now.
You can't hide the past. The past is with us. And if we don't recognize the truth of the past, then we're not going to understand the truth of today. And if Americans can't grapple with frankly, the ugly truth of the Civil War, that Lincoln was an embattled, beleaguered president, that for most of his term, he was hugely unpopular. There were riots against him. There were conspiracies. We have to face the darkness in the mirror and not be afraid to learn the lessons from the past.
What we will be doing over the next 6 episodes of this series is a deep dive into a moment in American history that is little known and little understood, but which has much to teach us about the challenges that bedevil our country right now.
A lot of the people who got swept up in this conspiracy would have told you that what they were doing was the most patriotic act. It was the saving of the Republic, the saving of the Constitution, rather than the rejection of it.
This is the Copperhead Conspiracy. I'm Dan Gettleman. The plan that Captain Thomas Hines proposed to President Jefferson Davis in February 1864 was nothing if not audacious. Hines was a well-bred Kentuckian, handsome and smart, with a neatly trimmed mustache and piercing eyes. By the age of 25, he was already a seasoned veteran of John Hunt Morgan's cavalry and had masterminded a daring escape from the Ohio Penitentiary for Morgan and his senior officers. What Hines proposed to Davis was that a small force of Confederate soldiers based in Canada should conspire with large groups of Northern Democrats who were angry with the Lincoln government. Together they would storm the state capitals of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, remove the governors from power, and take over the states, which would then become allies of the Southern Confederacy. They would also free Confederate soldiers from Northern prisons and arm them with guns and ammunition stolen from state armories. And in this way, the Confederacy would have both the manpower and the political clout to force the Union to cease fighting and allow the South to peacefully coexist as its own nation, a nation where slavery would be forever legal. Davis dismissed Hines' proposal, as it would utilize tactics that he believed chivalrous gentlemen shouldn't use. But 2 months later, a Union officer was killed behind enemy lines. In his pocket were found military papers that appeared to indicate a plan to kill the Confederate leadership and burn down their capital in Richmond, Virginia. The evidence of this Union plot immediately changed Davis's attitude toward clandestine warfare, leading him to greenlight the plan that Thomas Hines had proposed earlier. Before leaving Richmond, Hines was given written orders from the Confederate Secretary of War outlining his key mission: to connect with Northerners who were furious with President Lincoln.
In passing through the United States, you will confer with the leading persons friendly or attached to the cause of the Confederacy, or who may be advocates of peace, and do all in your power to induce our friends to organize and prepare themselves to render such aid as circumstances may allow, on terms consistent always with the independence of the Confederate States. Respectfully, James A. Seton, Secretary of War.
The success of Hines' plan would largely depend on him finding a committed force of Northerners willing to take up arms against their own government. And for this, he wouldn't have to look very far. By the summer of 1864, the Civil War had been going on for over 3 years, and hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers had died by then. Many otherwise loyal Northern citizens were tired, worried, and pessimistic about the war effort. Among some members of the Northern Democratic Party, concerns about the war had even escalated to the point that some were willing to use violence to resist what they saw as unconstitutional abuses of power by the Lincoln administration. This was especially true after President Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, one of the oldest concepts in English common law. In practical terms, this meant that Lincoln had decided that in a time of civil war, many legal norms should be suspended and replaced with martial law. It needs to be said that the Democratic Party of the 1860s was very different from the Democratic Party of today. In many ways, they were more like the present-day Republican Party. They believed in a weak federal government, the primacy of states' rights, and the importance of individual liberty. The peace wing of the Democratic Party were known as Copperheads, partly because they used Liberty Head copper pennies as pins to identify themselves, and partly because they were considered as dangerous as a venomous snake. The Copperheads were a diverse group from varied backgrounds, with different things motivating them to take action against the federal government.
The Copperheads fell into 3 different categories.
Jennifer Weber is a professor of history at the United States Air Force Academy and author of the book, The Copperheads.
Either they were born and grew up in the South, or their parents had emigrated north from a southern state, or they still had family there in the South. The second was immigrants, particularly Catholic immigrants, because they had been vilified both for their religion and for being non-Anglo immigrants by the Know-Nothings in the late 1840s and early 1850s. Many of those Know-Nothings wound up being absorbed into the Republican Party. And so they regarded the Civil War as a Republican war and did not want to have any part in it. The third group is people who were just quite conservative Democrats, people who read the Constitution and understood the Constitution as an inelastic document. And they felt that much of what Lincoln did over the course of the war was unconstitutional.
The very existence of the Copperhead movement during the Civil War is something that has largely been left out, or at least minimized, in most of the American history textbooks used in our schools in the past 50 to 75 years. And few of us, I suspect, learned anything about the depth of anti-Lincoln sentiment among many Northerners, and how violently that dissent was sometimes expressed. Again, Jennifer Weber.
Abraham Lincoln is this hallowed figure now in American history. He routinely tops the list of America's greatest presidents. But in his own time, he wasn't regarded that way at all. Americans in the North were deeply divided about him. And there were Americans who absolutely loathed him. And it wasn't just a handful. There were people who started the war being more or less favorable to Lincoln, and it really helped Lincoln that the Confederates had fired first and initiated the war. But he took a number of steps that people found objectionable. And as time went on, as these decisions piled up, more and more people turned against him.
Among the objectionable actions that President Lincoln took during the war that enraged many Northerners were the Emancipation Proclamation, the establishment of a military draft, and allowing black men to join the Union Army. By 1864, even some of the war's strongest supporters ended up turning against it, and against the leader who was guiding it. One example is Brick Pomeroy, a Wisconsin newspaper publisher and a pro-war Democrat who ended up as one of the nation's most outspoken Copperheads.
To the point that by 1864, the summer of 1864 especially, he won't call Lincoln by his name anymore. He only refers to the president as the widow maker or the orphan maker, and he is openly advocating in the pages of his newspaper for Lincoln's assassination.
From the La Crosse Weekly Democrat, August 24th, 1864. He who wars against the Constitution of our country is a traitor, and Lincoln is one of these men. And if he is elected to misgovern for another 4 years, we trust some bold hand will pierce his heart with a dagger point for the public good.
Nowhere was the hatred of Lincoln and the Republican Party stronger than within a particularly radical group of Copperhead Democrats who had organized themselves into secret societies, known first as the Knights of the Golden Circle, then the Order of American Knights, and finally as the Sons of Liberty.
The United States at this time is awash in fraternal organizations.
Patrick Lewis is the president of the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, Kentucky.
The Knights of the Golden Circle started out a group of private American armies to go into Central and South America and win new lands, conquer new territories from the former Spanish Empire, and bring them into the United States. So, of course, all of these were abject failures and usually involved everybody getting lined up in front of firing squads and shot. But a lot of these folks who had managed to make it safely back into the United States sort of formed the Knights of the Golden Circle to further the goals of secession, particularly in places like the Upper South, like Kentucky, but also reaching across the Ohio River into the southern parts of now the Midwest, with the goal of trying to promote this idea of a Midwestern Confederacy. And you see the ways that they sort of incorporate Christian theology, American history, and the defense of liberty, and make them think that what they're doing is not just sort of an anti-patriotic sabotage of an active war effort while their cousins and their brothers and their neighbors are all out literally in the ranks putting their lives on the line, but it's in fact the highest form of patriotism. Their tagline is, "Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God."
One of the things driving these secret societies was a desire to establish something that was then called the Northwest Confederacy. Because the present-day Midwest was at that time the northwestern boundary of the United States. It was a part of the country that, in many ways, had more in common with the South than the states of the Northeast.
So I think that the idea of the Northwest Confederacy kind of goes back to an earlier period of American history before the Market Revolution.
Robert Churchill is a professor of history at the University of Hartford and author of To Shake Their Guns in the Tyrant's Face.
If you go back to the early years of sort of settlements in the Midwest, what you find is the way to get your crops to market is to build a raft and float down the Ohio and then float down the Mississippi River. In other words, basically all of the Midwest's economic ties are with the South. And so there is this idea among some folks in the Midwest that the South is the natural ally, that the Midwest has more in common with the South than it does with the industrialized Puritan Northeast. And hence that the Midwest really doesn't belong in the Union, that the Midwest's true affiliation is with the South. The problem is the vast majority of folks in the Midwest don't agree with that. But there is a small faction of folks in the sort of Copperhead faction of the Democratic Party who cling to that idea, that the thing that they have to do is to organize this sort of mass anger and resistance at the draft and anger at emancipation. And if they can harness that, then they can stage an uprising and they can break the Midwestern states away from the Union and probably in the process stop the war dead in its tracks.
For the Confederates, this movement toward a Northwest Confederacy was deeply attractive. as they were actively seeking ways to pressure the United States beyond the battlefield. And so a conspiracy emerged between the Confederate government and the leadership of these Copperhead secret societies in the North.
By the second half of 1864, there will be three currents that begin to merge, which will eventually lead to the conspiracy.
Julian Schur is a journalist and the author of The North Star, Canada and the Civil War Plots Against Lincoln.
First of all, you have growing numbers of Confederates who are prisoners in northern prisons quite close to the Canadian border, something like 215,000 prisoners. And the Confederate agents in Canada were eager to storm these prisons and free these prisoners. In fact, John Wilkes Booth, his plot to kidnap Lincoln, that was his first idea. His whole idea was to kidnap Lincoln to force the Union to free tens of thousands of Confederate prisoners. The second thing you have is this widespread dissatisfaction in the Northwest states, from Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri. There was a sense among the Confederates that there was a willingness among the people to overthrow these governments. The third factor you had is the Democratic Party was holding its convention to name its leader who would take on Abraham Lincoln. And one of the plots was to have basically a takeover of the Democratic Party by the most Copperhead sympathizers that they could find. And the man who crystallized all these three currents, the prisoners held in northern jails by the Union, the dissatisfaction in the Northwest, and the political takeover of the Democratic Party, was a man named Clement Vallandigham.
Vallandigham was a Democratic congressman from Dayton, Ohio. He was one of the strongest critics of Abraham Lincoln in the North, giving stem-winding speeches on the floor of Congress that condemned the president for his various wartime policies.
I have denounced from the beginning the usurpations and the infractions, one and all, of law and constitution by the president and those under him. Their repeated and persistent arbitrary arrests, the suspension of habeas corpus, the violation of freedom of the mails, of the private house, of the press and of speech, and all the other multiplied wrongs and outrages upon public liberty and private right, which have made this country one of the worst despotisms on earth for the past 20 months. And I will continue to rebuke and denounce them to the end.
Vallandigham was a three-term Ohio representative and was one of the most forceful leaders of the Copperheads. He denounced Lincoln, this is his words, for having plunged the country into a cruel and bloody and unnecessary war. And he railed against what he called the enslavement of the white race by debt and taxes and arbitrary power. And finally, he said, if standing against Lincoln means ending this war, he said, I am all over and altogether a pro-slavery man. Well, Lincoln was getting more than a little upset at this very powerful orator and leader.
Lincoln considered Vallandigham a danger to the nation, and he would eventually be expelled from the United States for his treasonous rhetoric. But that anti-Lincoln rhetoric was music to the ears of the Confederate leadership in Richmond. And by the late spring of 1864, Vallandigham, living in exile in Canada, was regularly meeting with both Confederate Captain Thomas Hines and Jacob Thompson, one of three commissioners sent to Canada by President Jefferson Davis. Hines and Thompson were actively looking for Copperheads they could collaborate with on Hines' proposal to topple the Midwestern state governments. By this time, Vallandigham had become Grand Commander of the Sons of Liberty, and he promised Hines and Thompson that he could muster thousands of the Secret Order's members to take direct action against their shared foes. Hines reported on his conversations with Vallandigham and Thompson in a June 1864 report sent to the Confederate Secretary of War.
The Confederates in Canada are to gather with 2 regiments in the process of formation at Chicago, which will be placed under my command to move upon that place for the release of prisoners confined to Camp Douglas. Simultaneous with this movement, the Democrats in every county of Illinois and portions of Indiana and Ohio will rally to arms. A force of 3,000 Democrats under a competent leader will march upon Rock Island for the release of the 7,000 prisoners held there. 5,000 will move upon Indianapolis, where there are 6,000 prisoners. The remainder will concentrate upon Chicago and Springfield. The state governments of Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois will be seized and their executive heads disposed of. By this means, we hope to have, in the days after the movement has begun, a force of 50,000 men.
How did things get to this point, where Northern citizens were angry enough at the federal government during a time of war to conspire with agents of an enemy government to take up arms against it?
For some Americans, they felt that it was rigged. They felt that it wasn't legitimate, and they didn't really accept Lincoln as their president.
That's next time on the Copperhead Conspiracy. The Copperhead Conspiracy is a production of Reckoning, Inc., with funding and scholarly assistance from Ohio Humanities. It was produced and narrated by me, Dan Gettman. Our historical consultant was Dr. Stephen Rockenbach. Voice actors were Alec Voles and Barrett Cooper. Our theme music was composed by Ja'Cory Arthur, with other music licensed from Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Nina Ellis, Louisville Public Media, and to Loretta Williams for editorial guidance. Major support for this series was provided by Archon Construction. Additional support from Jay and Susan Giles, Doreen Juha Sauer, Lopa Mehrotra, and Douglas and Marissa Brown. Many thanks to Jennifer Weber, Patrick Lewis, Robert Churchill, and Julian Schur, whose interviews were heard in this episode. Please note that the views expressed by Jennifer Weber do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force Academy, the U.S. Air Force, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. If you would like to support our nonprofit organization and unlock bonus episodes of this series, you can do so at patreon.com/reckoningradio. Our first bonus episode explains all the key events in American history that led to the Civil War. You can access that and more at patreon.com/reckoningradio. For transcripts, a bibliography, and other content related to this series, please visit our website at copperheadconspiracy.org. Thanks so much for listening. Please join us next time for another episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy.